Hello and welcome back to Beyond the To-Do List, a podcast about productivity. This week I'm doing something a little different. This week we are doing a solo episode. It is literally just me, and honestly I don't remember the last time that I did this, but have been wanting to do this for a while. I've wanted to do a special episode in honor of Dan Miller, author of 48 Days to the Work You Love. Dan passed away in January of 2024 after a fairly quick diagnosis of cancer in December of 2023. And in his own words, from his last podcast episode titled After 17 Years, this is my last podcast. And think about that for a second. He podcasted for 17 years and it stopped in December of last year. As you can guess, I wanted to do this for many reasons. Dan meant a lot to me, both as somebody I admired from afar, but also somebody that I had a number of meaningful encounters and exchanges with throughout the time that I was in contact with him. And so I thought, well, let me give you a little bit more background on first who Dan is. And then number two, let me peel back some of the layers of the Dan that I got to meet. And in doing that, I can also share some lessons, some productivity lessons even, from him that I know he would have appreciated had I been able to tell him. Actually, some of it I was able to tell him, so I feel pretty good about that. But let's just say that it became quite a shock to see him announce in December of 2023 that he was doing his last podcast episode. And essentially what he said was he wanted us to hear it from him first. And he basically said that 3 weeks ago at that time, he was an extraordinarily healthy 76-year-old guy. One of the reasons, by the way, that I wanted to do this now is May 7th, I believe, was his birthday. And so having just passed that, it brought it back around that he would have been 77. And that also struck me because I would have been about the same age as my father, give or take. But he goes on to say, I mean, he ate a clean diet. He didn't smoke. He didn't drink. He exercised 5 times a week. And what happened was he had just been in Las Vegas with his 2 sons, Jared and Kevin, whom I've both met. They're great guys. He was at the U2 concert at the Sphere with them, and they were creating a lifetime memory, as he said. And I wish that I'd been able to talk with him about that experience, being such a U2 fan myself. But while they were there, he wasn't feeling well, and that was unusual for him. So he called his doctor and he arranged an MRI when he got back to Nashville or Franklin. Actually, Florida. He was in Florida by then. Sorry. I was used to visiting in Franklin, Tennessee. But on December 7th, the doctors discovered he had advanced pancreatic cancer that had already spread to his liver and into his bones, and the prognosis was not good. But yeah, to flip that for a second, by the way, I love the fact that he got to go see U2 in the Sphere. I did not. I would have loved to, but that's a conversation for another time. But like I said, I wanted to, back in January, do this episode, this sharing of my stories of Dan Miller with you. And there are a few reasons why. One is you may already be aware of Dan. You may have already read 48 Days to the Work You Love. He's written a number of other great books, and you may be aware of Dan, and you know how awesome he was. He was a great guy, a great mentor, a great friend. And I'll get into more of that later with the stories I tell and the lessons that we can pull from that, or the lessons I've pulled from that I hope you can learn from as well. So one, you may already know of Dan, and that's great. I am so glad that you did. But two, I just thought, you know what? I really need to share who Dan was. You know, in this season, again, another thing that kind of piled on to the Erik, you need to put this episode out, was that my uncle, who had passed away a year ago in April, so April of 2023, who was also a big influence on me. We did a celebration of life service for him this past April. And then pretty quickly on the heels of that, I was also attending a celebration of life service for the father of a friend of mine. And so this all just snowballed, and I felt now's the time. Now I'm not being opportunistic. So with Dan's birthday having just passed, and with some of you knowing of him and some of you not knowing of him, either way, I'm hoping that we can reminisce, or I can be the person to introduce you to Dan Miller, which honestly, that's an honor. I know this feels like maybe I'm blowing it out of proportion or whatever, but it's truly not. And I think you'll see why when I dive in. So let me give you a little heads up on what we're going to do here. So number one, Dan was on this show only one time. That's a shame. It really should have happened more often, but I got to have so many in-person great times with him. So I guess that's the trade-off. But he had a killer episode, early episode. Like we're talking in the first 10 episodes of the show, he's in there. And I revisited that back when I heard this news and I listened to it and I pulled some stuff from that. So that's number one. We're going to talk about one of the main things that struck me about who Dan is and how he lived his life that came from that episode. Number two, I'm going to talk about two of the biggest characteristics of Dan and give you some stories that go along with that. And that's Dan's approachability and his generosity. I'll spend some time talking about some of the experiences that I had in person with Dan that'll give you a clue as to who he was and how he lived his life and how that rubbed off on me positively many, many times. And then we'll talk about Dan's lifelong learning. You heard that he was 77. He was healthy up till the end. And there was a specific moment that struck me about how he continued to have his eyes forward and did not have an ego about who he was, but he was always learning from any and everyone he could. So we're going to jump in. So I really hope that you kind of just follow along. I'm going to tell some stories. Sit back, relax, listen in. This will be fun. So like I said, Dan was an early visit to the podcast, an early episode, and I thoroughly enjoyed that. It's actually kind of how I got to know him. I knew of him previously to that episode because of connections with Michael Hyatt and others that were friends of his, and he said yes, and that plays into his generosity as well, which we'll talk about in a moment. But Dan said yes, and he came on the show, and at the time, he had come out with a book with his son, Wisdom and Purpose, I believe. I should have looked that up, but that doesn't really matter. That's not really the full focus or the thrust of that conversation. What was the thrust of it, though, or at least how it started, I'm not going to go through the whole episode. I will link up to that episode in the show notes. But the main point of that episode was we talked about his book, by the way, that is free, and I will include the link to the PDF of that, called The Rudder of the Day. And in that, Dan emphasizes the importance of starting your day right. And I would even throw in aligning with your chronotype, which is whether you're an early riser or a night owl or somewhere in between. What matters is, however your morning starts, that you are using that time to set up the rest of your day. And then Dan shared details of his morning routine, which I have been revisiting and starting to accommodate and acclimate into my own. So first off, he started his days without waking with an alarm. And I know that sounds a little crazy, but he preferred to wake up naturally. He would avoid the jarring disruption of an alarm clock. And he felt that this gentle start to a positive tone for the day helped him to wake up in a different mindset, a non-hustle mindset. And I love that. I truthfully do that too, to a certain extent. I do use an alarm and I use my Apple Watch to track my sleep. And it does the vibration that's light and starts off soft and then slowly grows in increment. And that allows me to, one, not wake my wife, but two, more gently wake up and rise more calm and less panicky, I guess. I will never be one of those people who wants to jump out of the bed and fight the day. Point being, that was how he approached it. And so he said that he would prefer to wake up at the same time every day. And he often had people asking him, well, how are you waking up early when you've got these early meetings when you've got no alarm to wake you up? Here's the thing. He just had trained himself enough. It's true. If you set your time, your body clock will internally wake you up at the same time every day if you habitualize it. And how he did that was he would have a more healthy, stricter bedtime. I know that another way that you can do this waking up naturally, which I'll put a link to in the show notes as well, is you can use an alarm clock that gradually increases the brightness and it's kind of daylight shining slowly to illuminate your room and not in a someone flipped the light switch on way that shocks you. Again, that's anti what we're trying to do here. So then he would do that with his wake up, and then he would get on his treadmill right away. He would work up a sweat for at least half an hour. This routine was not only for him to boost his physical health, but also to enhance his mental alertness, getting that blood flowing, those energy levels up for the day. And I got to say, I was more consistent with this back when he was on the show and was talking about this, and I was right there with him, and it was awesome. Whether he was listening to music or a podcast, which often that's what he did, he was engaging his body and his mind and starting his day with movement and motion, but not in a grind and hustle kind of a way. And then once he was done with that physical activity, he would get a healthy breakfast, a nutritious meal. Sometimes it would be oatmeal with fruit or, something plant-based, rich in nutrients, a smoothie, low in calories. It would fuel his body, replenish him, hydrate him, prepare his mind for the day ahead. And, listening to him describe this routine really locked it in for me back in, I think this was 2012. It really inspired me. And it was a lesson to me that this is somebody who has so much to do and is interacting with so many people. And yet he's calmly starting his day, focusing on himself, preparing his mind, his body, his spirit to be effective. There's a huge lesson there for productivity. So that's story/lesson 1. There's much more, by the way, in that podcast episode. And if you do go check it out, you'll get to hear me talk in a way less experienced podcaster voice. And it's kind of actually humorous for me to listen back to it. I think you will find that I have, at least to myself, grown a lot as a podcaster since then. So there you go. All right, story number 2. So Dan's approachability and his generosity is something I want to highlight here. One of the things that struck me the most about Dan was his, again, I called it lack of ego earlier, and when I was attaching that to his lifelong learning, he was approachable. He was generous. He would always be up for spending time with you and hanging out. He had so many people who wanted his time, and he gave of it. I mean, within reason, and there's a productivity principle in there that I will get to, but I will say that one of the times that I think it was actually maybe the first time that I actually got to hang out with him in person was back in 2014. It was January, and we were in Las Vegas for New Media Expo, previously called Blog World, now defunct. That conference does not exist anymore. But we were walking around on the expo floor, and I do have a picture of this. I'll probably include it in the show notes, but I have a picture of he and I at the Libsyn booth holding up our new t-shirts at the time, the first time I saw them, and it said #podcaster on it. And we're both holding it up. I don't know, that was a cool moment for me. But during that time, we were walking around the expo hall. He was asking me questions, getting to know me. I was able to get to know him better. But we also had our first experience with a TENS unit. For those unfamiliar, a TENS unit, TENS unit, it's a transcutaneous electrical nerve stimulation unit. So TENS. And it's a device that uses low voltage electrical currents to provide essentially pain relief. Now, I had a little bit of familiarity with it from my chiropractor. I would go to the chiropractor at the time. This is former chiropractor years and years ago. And, you'd walk in, he'd be like, all right, we're going to crank the voltage up. We're going to fry you and then we're going to crack your bones was the joke he would make. So I'd lay down. I wouldn't have a shirt on, and on my back, he would place some electrodes, and they would be a little lower than shoulder blades on each side and probably lower down the back. And he would then go over to the machine and dial it up, and the mild electrical current would stimulate the muscles and warm them up and get them to basically be malleable. And then that way, one, it was like getting a mini massage, but also it would get the muscles around the spine warmed up so that the spine could move a little bit as it was needing to, as he would then come in and crack the bones. So imagine my surprise when there was a personal TENS unit, and I didn't know what it was called at the time. I don't think that's what it was called then, but where this guy walks up to Dan and I, and he's like, hey, you want to try this little personal massager thing? And I'm like, what are you talking about? And it turns out, he's like, here, sit down. We'll hook it up and we'll show you. And they turned it on, and I was like, oh, I instantly realized what it was and what it was doing. And I was like, this is amazing. And it was just an awkward moment. We were both like, this is awkward. And then we're like, oh, this is amazing. And so Dan ended up buying 2 of them, one for himself and one for his wife. I ended up buying one too, and I ended up using it in the hotel room and all that. But these days, by the way, you can get a decent one. In fact, the one that I have right now that I use to go out of town with, if I'm driving somewhere, the seat can kind of wreck your back, or if you're flying somewhere, same thing. The one I have, I'm going to put the link in there for Amazon. It is like $25, and it is so worth it. It is basically like a little iPod Touch that then you plug in the little electrodes and then you attach them to your back or your leg or wherever you need it. You ever had that thing happen where in the middle of the night you kind of Charlie horse yourself? Well, this will help fix some of that. And I'm forever grateful for that. So that's a silly story that kind of goes along with it, but I wanted to share that little practical thing. But the fact that Dan and I were both open to do that. And then we were walking around and there was just so many different people that were coming up to Dan and recognized him and thanked him for the work that he had done or things they'd learned from his book or books, and especially his podcast, because it was a podcast geared conference. And Dan's generosity just extended beyond those small interactions. Back in Dallas in Podcast Movement 2022, Dan was that same approachable, generous person that I had encountered so many times before. He had just finished another book and he was enthusiastic and as kind as ever. And walking around that expo floor with him kind of brought back memories of the first time. And I just saw firsthand how gracious he was to everyone that approached him. He had a complete lack of ego. And I still wish that I could study that, but I guess my memories are holding that for me. There's another aspect to his approachability and his generosity. So one of the things he said was, Erik, if you ever are needing to come down to the Nashville area and you need a place to stay, you can stay at our place. Now, here's the thing. It wasn't actually in his house, which I'm not saying that's a good or bad thing, but what was actually kind of cool was I would be staying in his place that was called The Sanctuary there in Franklin, Tennessee. And it was essentially a very large, I don't want to call it a barn, but it kind of resembled that, yet not. It had a really large conference area for tables and chairs and people that would fit probably 50 to 75, maybe 100, I don't know. But then off of that, there was a wing that you would walk out into, and then there was 2 bedrooms and a bath, a full bath, a kitchen area, and that's where we would stay. And so I took him up on it a number of times. He never hesitated. I mean, I think the one time that it didn't work out was when he had family in town and they were staying there. So that was fine by me. Hey, I was a last minute inquiry, but I honestly can't even count. I think there was 3, 4, 5 times where I or Jeff C., who's been on the show a number of times, we would stay there at the Sanctuary and we would hang out with Dan there in the facility. We get to sit in his office with him, which was there where he would record his podcast and talk to him. And it was just a great time. Now, I want to point out here that he definitely had his boundaries. He definitely had structure. He would have priorities, but he allowed people into the inner circle, I think a lot more than other people would think that they would have the capacity to do. And I think that's just because he had so much structure in his life in terms of, again, what we were talking about previously with his morning routine that prepped him for the day, but also for his capacity for relationships. I don't believe he was an extrovert, and I don't get that impression from any of my time with him. He was an introvert, much like me. He would recharge by himself, but then he was able to be present and be generous with everyone. And I really admired that. And I know he would have certain structures in his life where he would add slots available for people to, when they would reach out, he would give them those slots. And as they would fill up, they would be full. But he would always leave those spots in his days/weeks, except for when, he was out of town or speaking or something, where he would allow people to visit and, he would meet with them. He would do coffee. He would do free coaching in a sense. And it didn't matter who it was. And so I knew that about him. And I thought this was an extraordinary kind of way to do that. And I kind of look at that as like, hey, people have asked me to be on their podcast and I've always loved doing that. And some people have been like, you've been podcasting? This is going to sound like I have an ego. Let me deflate that right now before I say it. There have been people who haven't been podcasting as long and they look at me having podcasted for a long time and they feel like they can't ask. And that's just not true. And so then when they do, and I say yes, they're surprised. I hope that I can be that kind of bringer of experience and wisdom like Dan was to those that have less miles on their podcast recording. So, hey, if you have a podcast and you hear this and you want to have me as a guest, reach out. Anyway, yeah, Dan was just incredibly approachable and very generous. And I just want to get that point across. And in fact, so much of that is still available in his old podcast episodes and his books. So definitely take a look at those resources. All right, number 3. So Dan's lifelong learning. One of the lessons I learned from him and how I noticed this was Jeff Goins had a conference called Tribe. And I think it went for 5 years. I think we joined, myself and Jeff C. I think we went to the 3rd, 4th, and final 5th year of that down in Nashville, Tennessee, or Franklin, Tennessee, I should say, at a facility called the Factory. It's kind of like this cool warehouse turned mall. And Dan would attend. And I think at least one or two of those times we were staying at his place when we went, and Dan would attend. And so the funny thing was Dan wasn't speaking, although I think he spoke once, but Dan wasn't speaking most of those years, but he was attending. So here's this guy, Dan Miller, who has authored many books, and he's mentored countless individuals. And he sat with us at our table, and he's taking notes during every session. And seeing someone of Dan's stature so engaged and eager to learn was humbling. And it reminded me to always keep an open mind and to continuously seek improvement. No matter how much experience I have or you have, there's more to learn. His dedication to learning and staying updated with current trends was evident in how he engaged with the speakers and that content at that conference. And I remember Jeff C. was sitting across from me, and Dan was sitting next to me, and Dan was sitting there writing. And I kind of caught Jeff's eyes and was like nodding my head sideways to Dan, gesturing that he was taking notes. He was sitting there taking notes. And by the way, this is the only time I then noticed it again at a different conference that I was at with Dan. And I happened to sit down next to him because I knew he would be full focused in on the content and taking notes. And so maybe I would learn more that way. But I gesture over to Dan, and Jeff looks at me and smiles. And then later we compare notes, and we're like, it shouldn't be this out of the ordinary. But we were saying, can you believe that Dan Miller was sitting there taking notes during someone else's session who has probably spoken a tenth of the time and has a tenth of the air quotes audience that Dan has? And, again, it shouldn't be that abnormal. It shouldn't be strange. It shouldn't be weird. But I do know that there are a number of people who they'll attend a conference and they'll kind of see what a session's about, and then they check out. And I'm guilty of this as well, but less guilty of it based on Dan's example. So just know that struck me, as well as Jeff, deeply when it came to our approach to moving forward and the different kinds of events that we would attend. We started to go to less large conferences and go to some of the more small ones, the more intimate ones, and then to be fully engaged, whether it was asking questions, paying attention, recording via notes, etc., just engaging. And I really appreciate Dan for driving that lesson home. And it's a good lesson to revisit. And I hope that if you're already that way, great. If you're not, I hope that you're kind of driving that stake a little deeper for the first time, or deeper moving forward like I did and I am now. So that's my experience with Dan. I just thought, let me give these 3 little compartments of my experience with Dan and just give kind of a signpost to the legacy he is and has, and the lessons that can be derived from that. And my real thinking here is, I hope this isn't, again, you're either already know of Dan, which is great, and hopefully this, you hearing my experiences rounds out and deepens your own existing experience, whether you knew him personally or not. But then I also hope that those of you that didn't ever know him personally, obviously, but through his work, I hope that you can find something from his work through the show notes. I'm going to list Dan Miller's podcast, the books from him, 48 Days to the Work You Love, other books, but also the free one, The Rudder of the Day. And then I'm also going to list that light-based alarm clock that I talked about earlier, as well as the TENS unit. But I'm also going to list 2 of Dan's kids, his daughter and his son, do podcasts. And I think that you'll find that his daughter Ashley's podcast, which is called Mama Says Namaste, it's all about life and family and marriage and creating that in the way that you would love. And then his son Kevin Miller has a podcast called What Drives You that's also based off his book. And in fact, I want Kevin to be on the show at some point in the future here. We've met and spent some time together. So I'll link up to both of those in the show notes. But again, I list up all these resources, and hopefully you'll get to know Dan in a way that you hadn't yet, one way or another. And I just hope that this kind of gives you a peek at something important, something meaningful, something outside of yourself, and is more of a reflective / catalyst for you to move forward in digging into Dan's stuff. So again, I know that me sharing these stories doesn't do justice, and there's no all-encompassing, like, there, I've done it. Now I've memorialized Dan Miller. Don't get me wrong. I don't think that that's happened at all. But I am kind of saying, hey, if you didn't know him and you didn't know his work, you still can. And if you did know him, you know that I'm only scratching the surface of how awesome he was. And either way, either of those camps or perspectives or your scenarios you find yourself in, I know that you would do good to find out more about him and his legacy and the work that he did and what he's left behind. And those that are continuing it, which I kind of feel like to a degree I am doing. So there you go. The legacy of Dan Miller. I can't do it justice, but I'm only 46, and so he was 31-ish years older than me. And if I get another 31 years, and I don't know how old you are, but you've got so many more years as well, there's a lot of good work we can do. And forgive me if this is a little out of the ordinary for you, episode-wise, but I hope that those of you that stuck with me to the end here enjoyed this. But if you enjoyed this, I would hope that you would maybe share it with somebody else. Maybe you know of somebody who is a connection or a fan of Dan's. You can share it with them, see how it helps them out and strikes them. Or, again, maybe you are intrigued by Dan through this and you know somebody who wants to be like Dan and this could help them. Share this with them. Let them know about it. And again, check out the show notes for all the links that I mentioned. And with that, I'll say thank you for listening, and I will see you next episode.